Shabbat Shalom. Every now and then, someone asks me if there's a place on the internet where rabbis go to get off-the-shelf sermons. You know, why write a whole new sermon if you can just take one that someone else wrote and use it? In earlier times, people would ask if there were books of sermons that rabbis would just copy and present to their congregations. The answer to that question is simple, but also not so simple. It's simple because, well, no. I can't just take a sermon that someone else wrote and use it. I could not just get up and read someone else's work and pretend it's mine. At the very least, I'd have to let you know that I'm giving someone else's sermon. But even then, I have my own style of writing and my own style of speaking, and using someone else's words for a whole sermon just doesn't work for me. No two people think exactly alike, so just using someone else's words for an entire sermon wouldn't say what I specifically want to say. So no, I don't just take a sermon off the shelf and deliver it on Shabbat. On the other hand, it's not so simple. Very few ideas that anyone has are truly, totally new and original. I've been studying Jewish texts for at least 40 years. I have learned with dozens of teachers over those years, and I am certain that many of the things that I say or teach, I have learned from my teachers and those texts. And sometimes I remember where I learned these texts from, hopefully a little more often than sometimes. There is a Jewish concept that when you teach something that you have learned from your teacher, and you tell people that you learned this idea from your teacher, and you mention his or her name, that brings a kind of satisfaction to your teacher, even if he or she is no longer still alive. So I frequently try to give attribution to my teachers when I know and remember the source. Of course, there are some things that I have seen or heard from several sources, and then it's difficult to tell who to give credit to, or indeed even if it's necessary, since it seems to be a matter of public knowledge, even if the public, in this case, is only a small group of scholars. So the answer is not so simple. Most of the time, the ideas for my sermons come from something I have read or learned, either recently or sometime over the last 40 years. I often will quote from sources, and when I do, I try to make sure to always let you know. Now, if it's a joke or a story that I found on the internet, I sometimes assume that you know I didn't make it up. I borrowed it. This long introduction is my way of saying that this morning, I'm going to use an idea I just read in a book of Torah commentaries. More than that, I'm actually going to quote several paragraphs from it. The commentary is found in a book called Unlocking the Torah Text, an in-depth journey into the weekly Parsha. And it was written by an Orthodox rabbi named Shmuel Golden. He's written 5 volumes of this series, one for each of the 5 books of the Torah, and each Torah portion generally has several short essays examining a specific issue in the text, considering different ways to look at it, and over the past couple of years, I have found ideas for a few of my sermons from this set of books. I like Golden's writing and the way he approaches the questions. But this morning, I'm going to even quote several paragraphs from one of his Torah commentaries. Okay? So, Golden notes that the story this week begins with Noah and the flood and ends with the story of the Tower of Babel. The bookends, if you will, of the Torah portion are 2 stories of God regretting the actions of human beings and then responding to those actions with a kind of destruction. There are dozens of commentaries by Jewish scholars over the centuries explaining each story. What was it exactly that the human beings did that caused God to do what God did? And why did God choose to do the specific thing that God chose to do? And as you know, we Jews for centuries have loved to interpret the text in many different ways, often contradicting one another. How can we do that? Why do we do that? Well, because even though the different interpretations might contradict each other, they nevertheless come to teach us something about the world that we live in. The interpretations, in my opinion, are not supposed to tell us what actually happened. No one today knows what actually happened, or even if some of these things actually happened. What these interpretations are supposed to do is teach us something about the world we live in, to teach us something about how to live our lives. So Golden picks one interpretation of what the human beings did in the time of Noah, and one interpretation of the things people did in the Tower of Babel. And the way he connected the two ideas, he builds a picture that shows how they relate to each other. So here it is. According to one interpretation, the reason God regretted human activity in the story of the flood was violent theft. The Talmud, Golden notes, expands on this idea. Rav Acha asked, "What did they steal?" A merchant would walk through the marketplace with a container filled with grapes, and each passerby would reach forth and steal a small amount, less than he could be called to judgment for. Golden explains that from this interpretation, the sin of the generation of the flood lay in their mocking of societal norms and laws. Driven by personal greed, each individual steals from his neighbor, but he does so in such a way as to escape the reach of the law. By the time the merchant reaches the end of the marketplace, he has no grapes left. No one, however, can be taken to court. Societal rules have been rendered ineffective in the face of personal greed. So the individual theft didn't seem like a big deal, but in the big picture, it's a disaster for society. In other words, it's not just that people are stealing from each other, it's this breakdown of societal norms. No one cared for the welfare of the society as a whole. It was every person for himself. Whatever you could get away with was okay. Lie, steal, cheat, or worse, as long as no one could prove and find you guilty of something that actually violated the law, it was okay. But then everyone ends up seeing that the rules really have no meaning, so the entire society breaks down. What about the Tower of Babel? What was the behavior of the human beings that caused God to intervene? Here, Golden chooses a well-known midrash, a rabbinic interpretation. The midrash notes that the tower, according to the Torah, was made of bricks. So the bricks would be brought up from one direction while the descent went down the other side. And if a man fell down and died during the process of construction, no one cared. No one paid any attention at all. If one brick fell, however, and smashed into pieces, everyone would sit down and weep. Woe is us! How will we ever find another brick to take its place? The Midrash, Golden writes, clearly based on hints in the text, which describes that the driving force behind the creation of the Tower of Babel was a desire to create a societal name. So Golden writes that this Midrash details a frightening civilization in which communal needs takes total precedence over the individual value. Those working on the Tower of Babel cared not at all about the lives of their neighbors. Person dies, who cares? All that mattered was the creation of the tower and the society it represented. In the eyes of the rabbis, Golden continues, the two civilizations described in Parshat Noach reflect polar extremes. The society in Noah's time was characterized by individual greed at the expense of communal structure. The generation of the dispersion, on the other hand, was willing to sacrifice the individual for the creation of the society. The ultimate punishments inflicted by God upon each of these generations perfectly fits their crimes. The generation of Noah, which was marked by individual greed and corruption, could only be addressed by total destruction. None of the individuals, other than Noah and his family, could survive. When it came to the builders of the Tower of Babel, however, the problem was the society, not the individuals. And in this case, therefore, only the society is destroyed. And so Golden concludes, in every generation, societies face this dilemma: how to balance the needs of society against the freedom of individual self-determination. that should be afforded to each person. Each individual is created in God's image and has immeasurable worth as a result. Human free will is a crucial part of what it means to be a human being. But society also needs to regulate behavior for the benefit of everyone, to create a society that is just and fair, kind and compassionate to the extent possible. Finding the balance between these two poles is an eternal challenge, and that is still our challenge today. By choosing these two particular commentaries on the story of the flood and the story of the tower, Golden has put together a framework for understanding a relationship between these two stories that really does speak to the world that we live in right now. And this is a challenge that we continue to face in our own day. Shabbat Shalom.